Hello and welcome. This is Microsoft Flight Simulator and this is the Phoenix Airbus A320. And today we are returning to our mini-series called Finer Points. You guys seem to have really enjoyed this mini-series, so I decided to come back and cover a few more topics. So for those of you who are new to the channel, first of all, I'm a real-world A320 pilot, and Finer Points is about these little details that we need to think about in the real aircraft and that you may want to emulate in the sim to make your flying that little bit more realistic. Okay, without further ado, let's get started. The first topic I find super interesting, and it's actually a little bit controversial. So we're flying along here, it's a cold winter's day, and as you're probably aware, the aircraft, like most aircraft, has a fairly complex anti-ice system. For the most part it's electric on the A320, so all these little things you can see here, pitot tubes, static tubes, the AOA probes, everything is actually heated on this aircraft. By the way, the heat starts when you start your first engine or when the aircraft senses that it is in the air. So even if you would lose both engines whilst flying, you would still have all these instruments heated, and that's of course very important because we cannot have them ice up on us. But the one thing I want to talk about is the windows. So the windows are also heated. In fact, if you fly an A320, at least that's my experience, you sit in the cockpit and you lean against the window. The windows are actually quite warm, almost hot. And this can be nice on a cold day, but in the summer it's sometimes not so comfortable. Anyway, what happens if the window heat fails? And this is where it gets interesting. So according to Airbus, the main concern is icing and fogging up of the window. So if it happens on the pilot flying side, you're no longer to perform an auto land, for example. So you're limited to Cat 1. There's a few things you cannot do, there's a certain amount of limitations, but it all has to do with the threat that the window will actually fog up or ice up. However, there's another thing, and I think this is something that is left over from, let's call it, the olden days. So when a window is heated up, it actually changes the properties of the glass. It becomes a bit more flexible, and that means it is better at absorbing energy. And what that means is, if you have a bird strike, it fares better than when the window is cold. So I have heard that many years ago it was procedure that if you lose your window heat, you must fly no faster than 250 knots below 10,000 feet. And the reason being that below 10,000 feet the chances of a bird strike are the highest, and the manufacturers wanted to ensure that the bird doesn't cause any harm or damage to the actual window. So, according to Airbus, all these new modern windows that we see here are actually being tested with the window heat off. And they're being tested for bird strikes with speeds way beyond 300 knots. And according to Airbus, there shouldn't be any problem. But you will find that a lot of pilots, even airlines to my knowledge, will tell you that if you lose your window heat, you should limit your speed to the lowest possible nominator in order to avoid any kind of additional damage that a bird strike would cause should you hit a bird at a high speed, let's call it, directly onto the windscreen. So I don't know, in my company we don't have a specific procedure for this. I do know there are some flight instructors with a huge amount of experience. I have a lot of respect for them that say this is something you should keep in mind. Yes, Airbus does test it, but why provoke it? We all know that a cold window is just not as flexible as a hot one, and that it will not be as good at absorbing the energy. So why, push it? So the idea seems to be that if you do lose your window heat, just reduce your speeds below 10,000 feet, maybe slow down a bit earlier for the approach, because if you have a bird strike onto the window, chances are it causes more damage than otherwise. So that's the thinking behind that. And you know, some pilots put 100% trust into Airbus and just say, no, I fly this as usual, whilst others seem to be more cautious. I'd love to hear what you think about this. I don't know if any of you out there are Airbus pilots, maybe you work for a company, do you have a procedure regarding this? So in my company, like I said, we do not have a procedure, they trust Airbus, but a lot of training captains just make you aware of this fact and want you to think about it should you lose your window heat. The second topic represents a proper deep dive into the Airbus systems, and I'm actually not quite sure if Phoenix has simulated this. I'm going to show you. I did a bit of a test, but to me it wasn't quite conclusive. So anyway, let's jump in. Let me explain what it is about, and then let's have a look if the Phoenix A320 can actually do what I'm trying to do. So as commercial pilots, we're always trying to be, you know, as efficient as we possibly can. And as we discussed in several other videos, one of the best way to descend is to have the engines in idle the entire time. So we're gonna stay at our cruising level for as long as we can. Oh no, the cat. Apologies, the cat wants some food. Yeah, I'll be right back. Okay, apologies for that. So, like I said, we want to stay at cruising altitude for as long as possible, then basically put the engines into idle and almost glide the aircraft all the way down to the ILS. Now, there's two ways of doing this. One is simply by open descent. So if we select a lower altitude and we pull, we go into open descent, and this means that the engines are going into idle and the aircraft will just descend and keep that speed. And that of course gives us a lot of opportunity to adjust the rate of descent. If I increase the speed, the engines will remain in idle, but as you can see here, the aircraft will just use the pitch to speed up, and this is very useful if you're too high, for example. The second option is to use a managed descent. So if you actually have a flight plan here with a runway and an approach, the aircraft will show you exactly where the top of descent is, the most efficient one. Instead of pulling, you push. This will activate managed descent, and the aircraft will do exactly the same. The engines will go into idle and it will just fly down the approach in idle. According to Airbus, a managed descent is more efficient than an open descent. But how can that be? Because in both cases, the engines are clearly in idle. I mean, how can it be more efficient than idle? Well, this is something I actually just learned recently myself by someone who's a technical pilot who knows a lot about the FADEC system and all that. So the way he explained it to me was that when you use managed descent, the aircraft shows you idle, but actually the engines go into a slightly different mode. And that mode means it will actually introduce a slight spin on the N1 fan, very, very slight, and that will increase the drag, meaning that you will descend a little bit faster, and therefore the top of descent can be a tiny bit later. It's not a huge difference, but if you do this on every single descent, you know, you have a fleet of, I don't know, 200 aircraft, it will of course have a big impact. I actually wasn't aware of this, but I find it very interesting that the software is so clever that it can do that. And it can only do it when you're in managed descent. If you're in open descent, it will just go into idle and the number one fan will just spin happily. So I've recently done a flight with the A320 and I tried this out. So as you can see here, I've chosen managed descent, and you can see the engines have gone into idle. Then I decided to switch to open descent to see if the N1 changes. And there was actually a very slight change behind the comma, you can see it there. But I'm actually not sure whether this is really because this feature has been implemented or just because we are descending, because you know, the lower you descend, there's a change in N1 speeds as well. So for me, the jury is still open whether this is implemented in the Phoenix A320, but even if it isn't, I think it's a nice bit of knowledge. So if you want to be super efficient for your virtual airline or just for yourself, managed descent is always the better option. And with that, we have already reached the end of this short video. So I hope you enjoyed it, I hope you found it useful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one. Until then, all the best. Bye bye.